The flight was supposed to be just another routine trip, a quiet journey from one city to another. Passengers were settling into their seats, placing their bags in the overhead compartments, and preparing for takeoff. Among them was an elderly black woman, her silver hair neatly styled, her warm brown eyes scanning the cabin as she carefully took her seat by the window. She carried herself with grace, her presence calm and composed. But little did she know, the man seated beside her was about to turn this flight into something she would never forget. A well-dressed businessman, impatient and agitated, dropped into the seat next to her with an exaggerated sigh. His sharp suit and expensive watch gleamed under the cabin lights, but his expression was one of irritation. From the moment he sat down, he made it clear he wasn't happy. He shifted uncomfortably, side-eyeing the elderly woman as if her very presence was an inconvenience. His sighs turned into muttered complaints, just loud enough for her to hear. He grumbled about how he always had the worst luck, how he couldn't believe he had to sit in this row, and how he should have booked first class. The woman remained silent, her hands resting in her lap, her posture poised. She had heard comments like this before, but when the man took it a step further, speaking to her directly with a tone dripping in condescension, other passengers began to take notice. He questioned if she was even supposed to be in that seat, hinted that maybe she had wandered into the wrong section of the plane. His voice carried across the cabin, drawing uncomfortable glances from those around them. Then, just as the tension in the air grew thick, a voice came from behind. Deep and authoritative. The businessman's posture stiffened immediately. A shadow loomed over his shoulder. He turned slowly, his confidence faltering. The look in his eyes shifted from arrogance to sudden realization. What he saw behind him made his stomach drop. He had just made a terrible mistake, and it was far too late to take it back. The officers exchanged glances as they tightened the cuffs around the man's wrists. He remained calm, his expression unreadable, as if he knew something they didn't. The lead officer, Officer Reynolds, glanced at his partner, who seemed just as confused by the man's reaction. Usually, when people got arrested, they protested, made excuses, or showed fear. But this man, he just stood there, his deep brown eyes watching them, almost studying them. It was unsettling. As they walked him toward the squad car, whispers rippled through the small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk. Some bystanders pulled out their phones, recording the moment, sensing that something was off. Do they even know who he is? One man murmured. A woman shook her head, looking concerned. They have no idea. The officers overheard the comments but ignored them, focusing on processing the arrest. Once inside the patrol car, the man leaned back, his face calm, almost amused. Officer Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced at the man through the rearview mirror. "You got a name?" he asked, trying to sound authoritative. The man smirked. "You'll find out soon enough." Reynolds clenched his jaw. He hated games. Turning to his partner, he gestured toward the computer. "Run his ID. Let's see who we're dealing with." His partner quickly typed in the information, but as soon as the results popped up, his face paled. His hands froze over the keyboard. Sarge, you might want to see this." Reynolds leaned over, reading the name on the screen. His breath hitched. His heart pounded. The name was instantly recognizable, a name that carried weight, influence, and power. Suddenly, the air in the squad car felt heavy. The man in the backseat tilted his head, his smirk growing wider. "Told you." Reynolds turned to face him, his throat dry. How had they not realized who he was? How could they have made such a mistake? A sinking feeling washed over him. This was no ordinary arrest. This was about to become the biggest moment of his career, and not in a good way. Reynolds' hands tightened around the steering wheel as the weight of the situation sank in. His partner, Officer Martinez, was still staring at the screen in disbelief, his face drained of color. "This can't be right," Martinez muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if trying to process what they had just uncovered. The man in the backseat remained calm, watching their reaction with an unsettling mix of patience and quiet amusement. Reynolds hesitated before speaking. "Who's your father?" His voice was steady, but there was a crack in his confidence. The man raised an eyebrow. "You tell me, officer," he replied coolly. Martinez exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "We just arrested the son-off." He stopped himself, suddenly aware of the body cameras recording their every word. He looked at Reynolds, who nodded, understanding his hesitation. The last thing they needed was for this footage to become public before they figured out how to handle it. Meanwhile, back at the station, their lieutenant was already receiving calls. Someone powerful was looking for answers, and they weren't happy. The desk surgeon's phone rang off the hook, and the officers exchanging paperwork at their desks started whispering among themselves as they glanced toward the holding area. Word spread fast. The man they had arrested wasn't just anyone. He was connected, and not in a small way. As Reynolds and Martinez pulled into the station's garage, their radios crackled. "Bring him straight to the lieutenant's office," a voice commanded. That wasn't standard procedure. Usually, suspects were booked first, processed, and then questioned. But this was different. The urgency in the voice made it clear they had made a serious mistake. Reynolds opened the car door, glancing at his partner. "This just went way above our pay grade." Martinez nodded, swallowing hard. The man stepped out of the car, stretching his shoulders as if he had just finished a casual ride instead of being arrested. "Hope you boys are ready," he said with a smirk. Reynolds wasn't sure what scared him more, the fact that they had arrested the wrong person or the storm that was about to hit when they walked him through that door. The station was eerily quiet as Reynolds and Martinez walked their suspect through the halls. Officers who were usually caught up in their own tasks suddenly stopped to watch. Some whispered to each other, others exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of the moment pressed down on them, but the man in cuffs remained unfazed, his posture relaxed, his confidence unshaken. The lieutenant's door was already open when they arrived. Inside, their boss stood stiffly behind his desk, his jaw clenched, his fingers tapping against the wood in a slow, deliberate rhythm. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his body spoke volumes. Next to him, a man in a dark suit leaned against the window, arms crossed, his gaze locked onto their prisoner. Reynolds didn't recognize the man, but he didn't have to. The air in the room was heavy with authority, and it was clear they had stepped into something much bigger than a routine arrest. "Sit him down," the lieutenant ordered, his voice low but sharp. Martinez hesitated for a second before guiding the man to a chair across from the desk. As soon as he was seated, the suited man finally spoke. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice was calm, but the controlled anger underneath was unmistakable. Reynolds swallowed hard. "Sir, we followed protocol." He matched the description off. "Of a suspect in a robbery?" The man cut him off. "Did you even bother to check who he was before you cuffed him?" Reynolds and Martinez exchanged a quick glance. They had checked, too late, and now they were standing in the aftermath of their mistake. The man in the chair finally chuckled, shaking his head. "They didn't know," he said, looking at the suited man. They really didn't know. The lieutenant exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. "You two just arrested the son of one of the most powerful men in the state." His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words hit like a hammer. Reynolds felt his stomach drop. The pieces were falling into place too fast, and none of it looked good for them. The man they had arrested wasn't just anybody. He was someone untouchable. And now they had to face the consequences. Reynolds felt a cold sweat forming on his forehead as the weight of their mistake fully settled in. The man in the suit, who still hadn't introduced himself, pushed off the window and took a step closer. His eyes locked onto them with quiet intensity. "You think this is bad?" he said, voice measured but laced with something dangerous. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Martinez shifted uneasily. "Sir, we followed standard protocol. If we had known." "But you didn't," the man snapped, cutting her off. "And now you've just tangled yourselves in something much bigger than a simple arrest." The tension in the room thickened. Reynolds could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. The lieutenant was still rubbing his forehead, looking like a man who had just realized he was holding a lit fuse.